Please welcome to the stage, Dean Keren Yarhi-Milo.
Hi, everyone. Welcome. I'm Keren Yarhi-Milo. I'm the Dean of the School of International Public Affairs and the Adlai Stevenson Professor of International Relations. It's wonderful to be with you. I am honored to be welcoming to SIPA our two IGP Carnegie Distinguished Fellows, Christiane Amanpour and John Feiner, whom I will introduce in a moment. But before I do, let me set the stage for today's discussion. Every new administration in Washington, as you know, brings with it a certain amount of change. New priorities are set, a different culture emerges, and we saw that, I would say, on full display at the Munich Security Conference, as Vice President J.D. Vance's remarks signaled a stark departure from the previous administration's position on the future of Europe, security, architecture, for example, the prospect for a peace settlement in Ukraine, and the security guarantees needed to deter Russia. Beyond Europe, we've also seen other challenges to the traditional way of conducting U.S. foreign policy, from proposing to take over Gaza and turn it into a Riviera, to shuttering federal agencies like USAID, to threatening tariffs against key trading partners like Mexico and Canada. Without a doubt, this new approach will have a huge impact on the evolving role and reputation of the United States on the world stage, and it really raises critical questions for all of us. How will all of the above affect American credibility, both in the eyes of our adversaries as well as our allies? What does President Trump's preference for personal, transactional style diplomacy mean for peace talks in the Middle East, in Ukraine? What role will social media play in a world where major news breaks on Twitter, on X, or Truth Social, not on CBS or CNN? We are fortunate to have two expert practitioners in their own respective fields with us to make sense of the new approach to U.S. foreign policy from this administration. Christiane Amanpour really needs no introduction to this crowd, but I'll give one anyway. She is CNN's chief international anchor of the network's award-winning flagship global affairs program, Amanpour, which also airs on PBS in the United States. She's also the host of the Amanpour Hour, a Saturday show consisting of forensic interviews with the newsmakers, game changers, and cultural icons shaping the world. She has covered too many historic world events to name here, from the siege of Sarajevo to the wars in Iraq and in Afghanistan. She sat across from some of the world's most notorious strongmen, from Bashar al-Assad to Nicolas Maduro. Jonathan Feiner, who will sit next to Christiane, served as President Biden's principal deputy national security advisor from 2021 to 2025. During the Obama administration, he was chief of staff and director of policy planning at the U.S. Department of State, where he previously served as Deputy Chief of Staff for Policy. He also previously worked for 4 years as the White House, was working at the White House, including as a senior advisor to then Deputy National Security Advisor Antony Blinken, and as special advisors for the Middle East and North Africa and foreign policy speechwriter for the then Vice President Biden. And I am going to be moderating this conversation. And we're really thrilled to have both Christiane and John as IGP Carnegie Distinguished Fellows this year. Let's welcome them to the stage and let's dive right in. I will sit over here. Welcome.
Thank you. Lovely introduction. Great to be with you all.
is this your first time at SIPA, Christiane?
No, interestingly, my ex-husband, who you probably know, Jamie Rubin, he graduated from here a number of years ago, and we were asked by a previous dean to jointly give the graduation speech for this college. It was quite a few years ago, and we had some fun doing that. So
that's great, wonderful. What about you, John?
This is actually my first time here. I lived in New York during the first Trump administration, but never made it up here, so good to be here.
Wonderful. The students we're all very excited that you're here with us. A lot for us to talk about. Christiane, let's start with you. You just came back, returned from the Munich Security Conference. Really, this year, everybody talks about it. This was really historic conference. And you interviewed, once again, the Ukrainian President Zelensky, this time about the upcoming talks between Donald Trump and Vladimir Putin to strike a deal in Ukraine. Many of us watched that interview, but let me ask you, what was your takeaway from this interview?
From President Zelensky. Well, first of all, I've had a sort of a series of interviews with the Ukrainian president since 2020. And then the most consequential one probably was in 2022, which took place at, again, the Munich Security Conference on the stage. He had given a speech in which he really was essentially begging for Europe and the United States to recognize the terrible threat to the continent and going back, to the Second World War and explaining what might befall the continent should Russia win. This would be a second invasion. The Biden administration had taken the unprecedented step of revealing so much intelligence, showing the world that actually Russia was posed to intervene and invade. And in 22, on the stage, Zelensky, certainly in public, was not willing to say that he thought it was going to happen. He was still holding out hope at that time, even though he had been briefed by Vice President Kamala Harris at the summit. So, cut forward to this year, interview him again, and it's a total turning point, because then it was how are we going to survive an invasion, and now it is how are we going to survive a peace negotiation if it takes place around our back. So the most important aspects that I got from Zelensky this time around, he gave a very, very well-received speech. He got a lot of standing ovation after his speech, and then I sort of drilled down onto a few issues during the time we had together. And his first and most important point was to repeat the mantra that has been US, NATO, Ukrainian mantra since 2022, nothing about Ukraine without Ukraine. So he was rejecting any idea that anybody would try to create any kind of negotiations or peace proposals or whatever it might be without them at the table. And then, when we learned 24 hours later that actually the US was going to Saudi Arabia to meet with Lavrov, etc., they told me, a Ukrainian official told me, we were not informed and we're not involved. At the same time, he said, this is a personal story, but he said, look, President Putin spoke to President Trump first, and then President Trump spoke to me. I think I should have been the first one. I think I should be, in this case, the first to be talked to, because we're the ally, we're the recipient of American help, we are the ones upon whom essentially the security of Europe rests. So there was that, and so he was very, very adamant that we will not accept anything done behind our back and with us not at the table. At the same time, also Europeans were as well. But I will just say one other thing. There was reports in the press at the time when we spoke that the current Treasury Secretary, Scott Bessent, had basically presented the Ukrainians with a paper outlining the Trump administration's desire to have a 50% equal opportunity in Ukraine's vital natural resources and its rare earths and etc. And they rejected that as well, because they said that smacks of colonialism and that this is our economy. And yes, we want to make a deal with the Trump. You might know, obviously you know more about this because they held off making that same deal with your administration. But they want to make a deal, but they don't want to give away their entire wealth at this point.
So we will talk more, obviously, about Ukraine. John, let me turn to you, because you were obviously very involved in this conflict, in this war. If negotiations right now, if they move forward, What kind of security guarantees would the United States and Europe, you think, need to extend to prevent another Russian invasion?
It's the right question. And just taking maybe a half step back about this broader topic of negotiations, sometimes it's hard in this period when there is so much happening to know what is consequential, what isn't, what is outrageous, what isn't. And I do think it's important to say that the notion of sitting down and talking to Russia is not in and of itself outrageous. I don't think I'm breaking news to say that our administration spoke to the Russians directly during the course of this conflict. We didn't do it in Saudi Arabia. We didn't do it in as flamboyant and public a way as the talks that took place over the last day or so. But we talked to them. We talked to them about primarily two topics. One, managing the risk of escalation, in particular the possibility of nuclear escalation, which at one point we were worried about. And then we did negotiate with them about the release of American citizens who were held hostage in Russia. What we didn't do, though, is talk to them directly about how to end the conflict in Ukraine in a way that excluded the Ukrainians. And so it's that piece that is troubling, I think, to some people. And we didn't do it without close consultation with our European partners and allies who were involved in every single thing we did in Ukraine during the course of our period. And I'm sure you'll ask more questions about that relationship. So the other problem, I think, that exists in these talks is that there really are two main issues. One is security guarantees, as you rightly flagged. The other is Ukrainian territory and how much of it Russia will be able to keep, if any, at the end of the conflict. And the other problem I think that people have with how these talks have unfolded is the administration came out almost preemptively and made concessions on those two core topics. The defense secretary said something to the effect of Ukraine should not join NATO, which is the main security guarantee they're seeking. We were supportive of Ukraine ultimately joining NATO, maybe not right away. And that Ukraine will ultimately not get all of its territory back. Now, they've since reversed those positions, said everything is on the table, but starting off talks by basically taking a half step in the direction of Russia did not inspire a lot of confidence among certainly the Ukrainians and I think others who are watching.
I just wanted to add to that because it obviously, you know, they said and then they walked it back. A key Republican, I believe, congressman, is it Wicker, congressman, head of the armed head of the armed services in the Senate, basically said that Hegseth had made a rookie mistake and he shouldn't have done that in public. And that was pretty much the boldest a Republican has been about this current state of affairs. And I think the other thing is that, you know, unfortunately in his public comments, whatever he might think he can do behind the scenes with Russia, President Trump in public seemed to take Russia's views of how the war started, how it should end, essentially almost blaming the Ukrainians for starting the war, which, as we know, is not true. There is a thing such as truth. I'm in the truth business, and we know that this is not true. The other thing which I think is really important to remember is that the security guarantees for Ukraine were enumerated during President Clinton's term, when President Clinton, along with, I think it was Britain and France, I can't remember, but also Russia, Boris Yeltsin's Russia, promised, I know it wasn't a treaty, but it was a memorandum of understanding, that if Ukraine, because the US insisted that Ukraine give up its nuclear weapons to Russia, they thought Russia would be more responsible with the nuclear weapons than Ukraine, that was a security guarantee. They would guarantee Ukraine's security and its sovereignty if they came under any attack, including, well, Russia was part of it. So Russia was part of this security guarantee. So it just goes to show how far we've gotten from any kind of guarantee to a sovereign, independent, democratic, you know, westward-leaning country. And that is the big, big issue. And it was suggested that I should try to press Zelensky on stage as to the security guarantees. I don't think he was very clear. He wasn't very clear. But for sure, it's going to need peacekeepers. I mean, I have covered many, many wars and then their aftermaths. Even if it's not a peace treaty and it's just a ceasefire, there absolutely needs to be an enforcement mechanism. And that's going to have to be robust, not some little thing with a few soldiers here and there. It's a 1,300-kilometer front line. And there has to be more than just a tripwire. The tripwire has to be backed up. And so I asked her, who was at this conference, I don't know whether I should name him, I'm not sure whether he told me officially, we were just chatting, but he was a Trump administration official. He did have, his brief did include Ukraine. And he said, I believe in the end it will come to, not American boots on the ground, but American intelligence, the American ability to have air power and eyes on to tell whoever is keeping the peace what Russia may be doing, and air defenses. So this is going to be really important. It's considered unlikely that the Europeans, no matter how willing they might be, no matter how many forces they might commit to a peace thing, if, by the way, Russia even accepts that, you know, will need American help for sure.
So this is obviously very important, and we will monitor this, but let me go back to something you just said, which is obviously there is a clear departure from traditional U.S. foreign policy stand and from the Biden administration, and also kind of more radical even from the first Trump administration in some areas. So if you look at the kind of the chessboard overall, and looking at what is emerging as a kind of U.S. foreign policy, how is the world reacting? Who stands to gain? Who stands to lose from this transactional, some would say tougher, approach? This is a question to both of you. John, start.
Sure.
Start with you.
So again, I think just sticking with, and I'll drop it after this answer, I promise, this frame of like what is actually new and different and outrageous and what actually is a version of what other administrations, including ours, have done. There's nothing wrong with wanting your allies to do more on behalf of your collective security, shared security interest. We wanted that.
Right.
And in fact, we pressed our European allies in particular quite hard to do more to support Ukraine. First, to see that this invasion was coming, which many of them were reluctant to acknowledge before it actually happened. But once it was a sort of irrefutable fact, to do more to stand up for Ukraine. And the reality is, without going out and trying to extort them or insult them or blackmail them, they did. And in fact, I think it's sometimes not sufficiently acknowledged in the United States how much the Europeans have actually done, in particular in terms of financial assistance to the Ukrainians. They don't have a military as big as ours. They don't have stockpiles of munitions and other weapon systems on the shelf that they can transfer as easily as we can. But they did step up and provide, at a time of, you know, economic scarcity, as we're always in, significant resources to the Ukrainians that has kept their economy afloat. And they worked with us to seize, freeze, and then ultimately transfer the proceeds of Russian assets, the vast majority of them which are held in Europe, to the Ukrainians, again, on this theory that if their economy collapses, their will to fight, their ability to withstand this Russian onslaught will vanish. So again, nothing wrong with pressing them. They did step up. What is problematic about, in I think our view, what is happening now is actually more of a question of what is good for the United States and the world. We have a theory of the case, and I think, you know, we, the Biden administration, goes back to others, that if you are in a moment of great power competition with Russia over the future of security in Europe, with China over many, many issues around the world, it is better to have friends, partners, and allies on your side of that competition, as maddening as it can sometimes be to, you know, keep everybody focused in the same direction and coordinated. Their theory, to me at least, appears to be that actually these alliances are burdens on the country. They extract more than they provide to our security and to our interests. Just a fundamentally different way of.
But which is untrue.
I mean, that is my view.
Yeah.
But
No, but factually it's not true. Yeah. And as the resident European here and the person who's actually in the field covering this stuff, certainly the Europeans, I mean, it was said that they provided even the most financial aid. America did provide the most military assistance, obviously for obvious reasons. But, you know, I don't know whether you'll agree, John, that, you know, for years, let's say even since the Macron time, you know, there's been a long time when Europeans have said variously, we should have a European army. Or military, right? And the United States has basically kind of poo-pooed that because they thought at that time that it wasn't constructive, that, you know, you had the NATO alliance for all sorts of reasons. But the Europeans tried to do that. It was the Americans who said, No. So that's one thing. Europe has come to America's aid many times in the form of NATO or as a coalition of the willing. Obviously, NATO's Article 5 was first ever enacted after 9/11 on behalf of the United States of America. It's the first and only time it's ever been enacted, number one. Number two, even in the first Gulf War, it was Europeans and a coalition of international willing that supported President George W. Bush in his aim to remove Saddam Hussein from Kuwait in 1990, the first Gulf War. And again in 2003, an incredibly, as we now know, ill-conceived war against Iraq, which nonetheless got allies, American allies, to join in a coalition of the willing. So they have done their part. And even as John says, that they should, and of course it was the Obama administration who called on a higher NATO contribution in 2014, it can't be done overnight. You can't throw everything in the air and say, hey dudes, we're out of here, you're going to be responsible overnight. That's not reform. That is a really dangerous, almost a realignment of your alliances. Who are your allies? And why are you treating them like this? And I think that's the fundamental question I have. And why are you being softer, perceptively anyway, on your adversaries, like Russia?
So one very quick thing to add to this, and I think it's the thing to watch when it comes to kind of how this strategy that the current administration is employing will play out. When we came to office, the Biden administration, the Europeans were on the cusp of deepening their economic ties to China through an investment treaty that they were at the very end stage of negotiating, and they were massively dependent on Russia for energy, primarily gas. That investment treaty went away, in large part due to our deepening economic integration and breaking down some of the barriers from the first Trump administration with Europe, and their ties to Russia, Russian energy, have massively decreased, largely because we and other partners stepped in to fill the void when it became clear they could no longer depend on Russia after the invasion. Given the approach this administration is taking, I think it will be a very interesting question how that impacts the relationship between Europe and China. China has two strategic goals in Europe: prop up Vladimir Putin and deepen its connection to Russia, and deepen its economic ties to Europe. Those should be mutually exclusive goals. We made that case to them. You cannot deepen your ties to China while they are backing Putin in a war that's destabilizing Europe. I don't know that that argument is still going to be as effective now.
So let's talk a little bit about the axis of resistance. So we talked Russia. Let's talk a little bit about China, Iran, North Korea. Where do you think that we will see the biggest departure from previous U.S. foreign policy towards those actors?
I think some really big open questions. I mean, we've talked about the area that is going to be the biggest departure. That's clearly the approach to Russia, where they seem actually to have a goal of, they probably wouldn't call it rapprochement because they probably wouldn't want to use a French word, but basically a better relationship with Russia. President's talked about that a number of times. So it's not just about ending the war in Ukraine for them. They actually seem to want, as a strategic goal, better relationship with Russia. So that's one big departure. The other areas with these kind of axis of adversaries, or however you want to call it, adversary alignment, much harder to know. On China, they've actually said very little up till now about what approach they're likely to take to China. They have saber-rattled a bit about more tariffs, but they have not said a whole lot. And I think there is at least decent reason to believe that some people around the president are actually going to want a better relationship with China too, including resolving some of the outstanding economic tension between the two countries, trade tension, tension over sensitive technologies. That's going to be a big piece of business, very hard to execute, but I think at least as likely that they will want to go that direction as a harder line direction. And on Iran too, which is the other key country, North Korea is kind of in its own category. No administration really has effectively dealt with North Korea. I doubt they will either. But on Iran, every signal being sent is one more of continuity with the approach that our administration took, and I think for good reason. Iran is weaker today, strategically, in the world, in its own region, than probably at any point in recent decades. And I think the likelihood that this administration wants to go further than we went and start a war with Iran has been undercut a number of times already by the president. Iran is on the back foot, And I think there is reason to believe that they're going to continue to take the approach that we took. Try to avoid a conflict, try to keep Iran strategically weakened, try to strengthen our other partners in the region and hope for the best.
Just to add, I agree, and I think it's really fascinating because in the first administration, as you remember, President Trump pulled United States out of what was, in effect, an arms control agreement with Iran. It wasn't a peace treaty, it didn't deal with everything. But when it came to what everybody said was the biggest threat, i.e. a nuclear threat, the Obama administration negotiated a very, what everybody said, decent arms control agreement that held, and that according to the UN inspection agencies, Iran was meeting all its obligations under that. So US pulled out, Trump said he wanted a better deal, never made a better deal. What happens? Iran now has been enriching for a long time in these intervening 4 years and is very close, if it decides, if it wants to, is much closer to being able to weaponize. So I was fascinated with all that background to actually hear President Trump say, as he's doing his Sharpie with the executive orders and the maximum pressure and all the rest of it, almost like I wish I didn't have to do this, but, and then he said separately, and I know there's a lot of talk about how we with the Israelis, or we backing the Israelis want to go and bomb Iran and the nuclear facilities. Well, he pretty much indicated he didn't want to do that, right? And then he said that, that's how I read it. Yeah. Then he said, and I'd much rather, we can do it this way or that way, and I'd much rather do a deal. So I'm actually fascinated that having pulled out of a deal, which was doing pretty well, thinking you could get a better deal, now wants to go back into a deal, and it's better than wanting to go to war. So it'll be interesting to see what kind of a deal they can go back into. And what's also interesting is, even though the Iranians are, as you said, and they are, on the back foot since the whole Israeli adventure, they're sending ballistic missiles to Israel, etc., and having been roundly defeated, I think it's interesting that the president of Iran has indicated that he wants to go into some kind of deal, that the supreme leader, Khamenei, who although says something in public, has not stopped the idea of a potential negotiation with the United States. So I think that is a very interesting place for us to be looking at. But also on the other things you mentioned, North Korea and all the rest of it. The whole madman theory. I'm just going to give, just three. Yeah. I've talked about Iran, but President Trump has portrayed himself as somebody who can get better, stronger deals with some of these very difficult adversaries. So I covered the meetings between President Trump and Kim Jong-il. I was in Seoul, in Singapore, in Hanoi, and as we know, there was a lot of talk. There was, looked like something might happen. President Trump had played sort of the madman at the UN, little rocket man, this and that, and then there was a lot of words that were flying between Pyongyang and Washington, and then he comes up and says, we're going to do this. So we all thought there's a good chance. And only several years later, I had the South Korean foreign minister on the program, and I asked her about this. Did she expect that there'll be, under a Trump administration, another attempt with North Korea? She said, Christiane, it was a debacle. Hanoi was a debacle. And I practically fell off my chair on live television because no diplomats speak like that. So in my opinion, in my experience, Asian diplomats are the most diplomatic. And I was absolutely gobsmacked. So I said, why? What do you mean? And she said, well, things were going, and then there were these photo ops and this and that. And when the president got back to Washington, there was zero follow-up. Mm-hmm. So that's a problem for me, and it doesn't bode well, and I'd like to see how it may be different in this administration. Then the other thing, I'm sorry to say, even though the Biden administration executed the withdrawal from Afghanistan in the most catastrophic way, sorry, John, but it the table was set by President Trump, sorry. He decided to negotiate a withdrawal of the US troops, but in a way that gave everything to the adversary, to the Taliban. Even the US-backed, vaguely democratic government, who the US had been supporting with its NATO allies for 20 plus years, were not invited to the table. And the country, as I say it, was offered back to the Taliban on a silver platter. And we've seen the result. So we have to be super careful. Negotiation is good, and I'm just watching to see how it goes.
And it will be, really interesting to look at the entire chessboard, right? And to see whether the United States has a grand strategy and what it looks like in terms of dealing with those different actors individually, but also what is the real strategy that will guide this administration. So let's shift gears. We talked about geopolitics. Let's talk a little bit about aid and development. And Christiane, Secretary Rubio has said that his administration is committed to life-saving foreign assistance, even as it moved to fold USAID into the State Department and reevaluated its programs. In your opinion, what do you make of this transition, transformation, new thinking about foreign aid? I know, you've done a lot of reporting on this, you're in the field, you see the impact. How do you think this approach affects U.S. Global standing, particularly in the Global South?
Well, I had on my program shortly after this edict came down that, the USAID logo was pulled down from its headquarters, people were fired, massive, important, life-saving operations by USAID all over the world were stopped in their tracks. Women who had been fitted with devices for HIV and other, experimental treatment and prevention, all the rest, suddenly were there. What are we going to do? Are we going to stay with these things in us? Is this going to happen? What's going to happen? Doctors had to make very critical ethical decisions, having been fired and told to stop work, or save these women and do the right thing. So, I interviewed James Kunda, who, I don't know whether you know him, he was the deputy USAID administrator under George W. Bush and during the whole PEPFAR and all the rest of it. That also, I think, is under threat, which is, as you know, has saved something like 26 million lives in sub-Saharan Africa, especially South Africa. George W. Bush's AIDS program, it was phenomenal. He said, in a word, this is insane. Let's say a new administration comes in, has its own priorities, decides that it wants to go this way or that way or whatever. What you do is you call in, apparently you have an interagency, you talk, you set out your priorities, and then you say, well, we'll do a little bit less here, a little bit more there, whatever. Let's say there's bloat. Let's say there's some, weird handouts of money to weird places. But he said, this is not reform, this is wholesale destruction of America's foreign policy, which is not just, of its humanitarian policy, which is not just do good, it's also for America's security and projecting, soft power. As you all know, probably it was created in 1961 by President Kennedy in order to confront communism at that time. And he had read a book, I listened to a podcast saying, called The Ugly American in 1961, that a lot of the world's people viewed America as this overbearing, imperialist, warmongering nation that didn't care about people and were much more susceptible to what they viewed as a more welcoming message from the Soviet Union. So the Americans had to decide, how do we win hearts and minds and, by the way, do a bit of good? So how do we get all this done in one? Well, USAID. And certainly I've covered USAID operations all my career, and I can just tell you it's phenomenal. And when you see a sack of rice or flour or whatever coming to besiege Sarajevo or starved Somalia or wherever it is, and it says gift of the people of the United States of America, it's very powerful, very powerful, and it made a difference. And so now the podcast went on. Now there's a whole nother era of the ugly American, at a time when the people wielding more soft power are the Chinese all over the world. They've certainly doing it in Africa, where America is struggling to be heard and felt there, and elsewhere. And so it's a choice. Are you going to really try to win hearts and minds and save lives and project your influence and your soft power at a time when it couldn't be more crucial, or are you not?
And John, to your point, looking at both the announcement about USAID, also the announcement about what he is thinking about Gaza, it doesn't look like, if you look at the process of foreign policy making, it doesn't seem that it follows a real thought out, structured process of deliberation. And how does the absence of structured deliberation affect the outcome? How it's, how it's not just being rolled out, but how it's perceived and so on.
So first on USAID and then on your process question.
Yeah.
I love talking about process. Some
Yeah.
people find that less than interesting. My whole job essentially
it's
was
very
to manage
interesting.
national
Right.
security decision making. So on USAID, I think there are just three myths that are worth exploding to the extent we can. One is how much the United States actually spends on foreign assistance. If you poll people, they'll say 10%, some will say 50%. The answer is actually less than 1% of the federal budget goes to this. So, they can eliminate it overnight. It is not going to solve or even meaningfully address the deficit debt problem that they are focused on. The second is that USAID is focused on problems over there, and we need to focus on problems over here. Well, if there's one thing we've learned in the last 5 years, it's problems, especially the problems that USAID is focused on, pandemics, for example, that start over there will end up over here. Economies that disintegrate far away are going to lead to migration crises at our own border. So even something that this administration actually quite concerned about. So there is no meaningful over there and over here when it comes to a lot of the issues that USAID is focused on. And the last is, I think, Christiane's very important point, that this is not uncontested space anymore. Right. It used to be just the United States that was going around doing all these things all over the world. Now, if we are not building relationships with strategically important countries in parts of the world where USAID and our diplomats operate, somebody else will. Russia is extremely active in Africa, in addition to China being extremely active in Africa. And some of these countries are willing to do things that we are not, for reasons related to, very good reasons actually, related to our own values, but that help them get a leg up. They can direct government resources in a way that we can't, sovereign wealth funds. They can tell their companies, state-owned companies, go and do business in this place that really matters. We don't have that ability. Yeah. So we've got to use the tools we have as opposed to taking the tools we have and discarding them. On process, which I think is a very interesting question when it comes to this administration. Look, Democrats, our administration, I think I personally have taken some criticism from my colleagues on this. We do a lot of meetings on decisions, and we try to look at them rigorously and include people that actually know something in the conversation before we go out and say what we're going to do. It can sometimes be slower, although in my view, never meaningfully slow such that it led to a worse outcome. We can move very quickly when we want to. Yeah. We called meetings at all hours of the day and night when necessary to try to get something right. There's a different approach in this administration. Different approach in the first Trump administration too. But I think one thing to watch is how these decisions and whether these decisions that are announced actually stick in the way that they are announced. There seems to be an approach being taken that is go out and announce a policy and then essentially have a process in the aftermath. And maybe some of that policy gets walked back or eroded or altered or shifted as opposed to literally the opposite. Right. So I think some of these big decisions are going to stick and are going to have consequences, whether you think they're positive or negative. I think a lot of them are negative. Some of these decisions, I think, are going to evolve over time, like the tariffs that were announced on China, China, yes, but Canada and Mexico, and then all of a sudden evaporated overnight, for a month at least. So then we'll see what happens, 30 days.
Can I?
Yeah, please, jump in.
Except I've lost my train of thought. I'll ask you again in a minute. Oh, yeah. Let's say one was really trying to figure this out, and you say that what Trump is doing and his administration is a lot of posturing. For instance, I've heard endless analysts say that taking over Gaza, owning it, turning it into Riviera is not going to happen, period, end of story. People are not going to take, like Egypt and Jordan, will not take forcibly, ethnically cleansed, forcibly transferred populations. They're just not going to do it. But my question to you is, do you think putting that out there has the effect of getting the stakeholders in the region to actually step up more? Or is it just red meat to those in, as we know, in the right wing in Israel and et cetera, who would like nothing more than to see these Palestinian lands cleansed and for them to settle them again?
So I have two answers to this. Short term, tactically, I guess my answer is maybe yes. Yeah. Maybe it can extract a meaningful concession from a trading partner when you threaten a tariff. The Colombians agreed to take these 2 flights of Colombian migrants after Trump basically threatened to destroy their economy overnight. Maybe the Egyptians and other countries in the Middle East will do more to support the reconstruction,
rebuilding,
security, governance in Gaza than they might otherwise have, maybe. But I think the question also is at what cost over the medium and long term? What cost in terms of trust in the United States as a partner? Because you can only play this card so many times before all of a sudden the kind of basic building blocks and foundations of the relationship start to be called into question, and people start to think, well, who else can we rely on who's not going to try to extort us every 5 minutes for some relatively tactical concession that shouldn't even be that important to them, let alone to us?
Were you surprised by what he said on Gaza?
Sure. I don't think anybody could not be surprised and shocked by a statement like that, as I suspect you were as well. Yeah. But I guess I saw that probably as an attempt to grab a headline, achieve one of these tactical gains, more so than an actual statement of a plan. To be honest, I have no idea whether this is something that was even discussed before going out and sort of stating it in that press conference. Presidents do that sort of thing sometimes. By the way, presidents from both parties do that sort of thing sometimes to leave their staffs and their teams scrambling to try to figure out, okay, how do we actually make something out of this? So I don't know the answer to that. I'm not exactly consulted by this team, but yeah, I was pretty surprised.
Can I ask you a question? Do you mind?
Please,
here we go.
That was bound to happen.
In the fullness of time, and given where we are now, do you regret what you just said, that sometimes, maybe too much, your administration was overly concerned about the dangling of a nuclear threat by Putin, which didn't happen and most people believe is not likely to happen, and didn't give more weapons with less conditions to the Ukrainians at that time?
So just to be clear about what
the next one is on the Middle East.
To be clear about what I did and didn't say, I didn't actually say that I regretted that we paid too much attention to the nuclear issue. My view is...
No, but you said you did pay attention
to it. We did pay attention to it.
I'm saying too much. Yeah.
So put yourself in the president's position, my position, Secretary of State's position, others. You are presented with an analysis, okay, from your own intelligence community. Yep. This has now been written about, so I'm not speaking out of turn here. Yep. That says if the Ukrainian lines are, the Russian lines are overrun by Ukraine, which was on the cusp of happening in a few places at an early stage of the conflict, there is a 50% chance, 5-0, that Russia will use tactical nuclear weapons on the battlefield in Ukraine. Now, you can dispute that analysis. You can say that analysis is insane or, way overstates the risk. But if you are a decision maker who actually has accountability and responsibility, if that analysis proves to be correct, you cannot simply discard it, not take it seriously, just not responsible to do that. And so what did we do? We met and we talked about things like how do we stop that from happening? How do we deter the Russians? Essentially scare them into not taking that step. And what do we do if they do take that step? If nuclear weapons are used for the first time since the 1940s, on planet Earth, what does the United States do in response? Because then the issue becomes actually much bigger than Russia-Ukraine. It becomes a global issue because the lesson will be drawn by other nuclear powers who think maybe we can menace our neighbors or other countries. Maybe we can even not just threaten, but use this weapon and get away with it. So what do we do to prevent that if this unthinkable, but now maybe thinkable, action takes place? So I don't want to, over-dramatize or sound melodramatic, but that is the situation we found ourselves in. And the one thing we did not do, which we are sometimes accused of doing in ways that sort of mystify me, is stop providing support directly to the Ukrainians that was leading to, and is still leading to, massive Russian casualties on the battlefield. American weapons that are directly leading to the death and injuries of 1,000, 1,500 Russian soldiers every week at some stage of this conflict. More Russian casualties in a couple of weeks, dead and wounded, than in the entire Iraq war for the United States at one stage of this conflict. So the notion that we sort of took our foot off the gas, we're too cautious, we're too risk averse, if you had told me those facts before February of 2022, that the Russians would take that sort of death toll inflicted by the Ukrainians with American support, and we would not have a nuclear response, and we would not have a response by Russia against NATO, that seems like a pretty good example of managed escalation and deterrence to me.
So that, by the way, this is exactly why we teach this exact, inside the situation rooms, those kinds of debates. And there is a debate within the academic community about what should have been done, could have been done. Those are real questions, and I'm obviously
I may be slightly biased on this question.
I'm a little
slightly.
biased too, because it's super important, and I covered the Bosnia War, which took 4 years for
Right.
the US and others to come in and to stop, based on the fears of what the Serbs and others might do. And of course, that was backed by Russia, although Russia wasn't on the ground. But I was there during the time when the Ukrainians on their own, without a huge amount of help, pushed the Russians back from around Kyiv and then Kharkiv and all the rest of it. And many NATO generals and American force commanders in Europe, this is the window of opportunity. This is when all the weapons should flood in, or as much as possible, and push Russia back, because they were on the back foot. So that's the only thing I'm saying. And many times your weapons, which were very helpful, obviously, without which it would be catastrophic, came late. It was like, no, yes. So that's all I'm saying.
Did you have a question about the Middle East before we move on?
I think you'll have the question on the Middle East.
Hoping she might have forgotten that.
Yeah. Well, there are a couple of questions about the Middle East. Let me ask you about Lebanon for a second. So the idea that, we saw Israel striking and killing Nasrallah led to an incursion in Lebanon, an invasion, and then the Biden administration said, well, we saw the fall of the Assad regime partly because of the Israeli operation there in Lebanon. It affected the whole, the players in the region, let's say. Do you think Israel should have attacked Lebanon early when they had an opportunity right after October 7th?
So I don't do well with counterfactuals because I think they're
Yes.
interesting and
Yes.
interesting to
We
write
do,
about.
by the way, this is a big topic when we ask students to write postmortems and do this kind of counterfactual analysis.
Oh yeah, I don't think it's not a worthwhile. I find it hard to be declarative and definitive about a counterfactual. We had a goal at the beginning of the conflict, post October 7th, that we did not want the conflict to spread to region-wide, full-on total war. And I think our concern, and I think it was October 11th when we had a series of very direct conversations with our Israeli counterparts, was that if they went at that moment directly at Hezbollah, the risk of the conflict exploding region-wide was extremely high.
Yeah.
Fast forward to the situation that you're describing in Lebanon, and where are we now? Because I think this is actually quite an interesting, and if you can even say this about the Middle East, somewhat optimistic moment, at least in Lebanon, and potentially, although with much bigger caveats, in Syria too. What had happened between October 11th and the period in the fall of 2024 and leading into 2025? A big thing that had happened is Iran had been substantially weakened and set back. Its ballistic missile program had been revealed to actually be unable to really hurt Israel if the United States and our core partners stepped in alongside the IDF and were able to fend it off. We didn't know that at the time. We knew that by the time the Israelis moved into southern Lebanon. And Hamas had also been badly degraded inside Gaza, obviously, as had Hezbollah, due to a year plus of sustained Israeli bombardment. After Hezbollah, it has to be said, attacked Israel just after October 7th. None of this is to defend. I think that is descriptive of the situation. So what you have now in Lebanon is, for the first time, really in modern history, a moment in which Lebanon's politics are not being directly dictated to them by outside powers. There is actually Lebanese political activity that is indigenous and being allowed to determine the course of governance and leadership. Now, will that last? Because Hezbollah is not gone. It's not eliminated. I think Iran's designs on Lebanon are also not gone and not eliminated. And by the way, Iran's not the only country that has had designs on influencing Lebanon over the years, including at different points the United States. But there is at least this moment now where the Lebanese, really for the first time in modern history, have a chance to try to determine their own future. Somewhat ditto in Syria, but with a few big caveats. So the Assad regime, which for decades has ruled that country with the most iron fist imaginable, in some ways is gone. I think it should be stated that is fundamentally a good thing. It should also be stated that part of the reason why it's gone is because its two biggest backers, Russia, which was bogged down in Ukraine, Iran, which had been weakened by the Israelis with the help of the United States, Ukraine obviously also weakening Russia with the help of the United States, could not come to its aid at its moment of most dire need. So the United States played a role in the inability to defend the Assad regime, even if that was not our strategic goal, and I won't pretend otherwise. So the question is, who's in charge now, and what are they going to do?
Yep.
Now, some of these people, including the current president, have a pretty checkered, and checkered is a big euphemism here, background. These people have ties to Al-Qaeda and ISIS and like every terrible group you can imagine. But they are also now declaring that they have changed their views about governance, changed their views about how society should be ordered. And nobody should trust that. There should be basically no trust, I think, when you're dealing with Middle East security situations. But we should also give that the chance and support it and try to steer things in that direction for the benefit of stability in the region and the people of Syria. And we'll see. I'm not going to vouch for them, but they are saying some of the right things and they have the chance to at least do the right thing.
It's very, very interesting to see. And obviously the other part, which is, I guess, what Christiane also has in mind, thinking about the Israeli-Palestinian conflict in the context of normalization between Israel and Saudi Arabia. This is also an effort that the Biden administration was working on. Do you think we could see in the next couple of years normalization between Israel and Saudi with a recognition that there is a pathway or plan towards a Palestinian, that is concrete, irreversible toward a Palestinian state, coming from the actors who are...
So other than counterfactuals, my second least favorite thing is predictions, particularly about the future in the Middle East. But I guess what I would say is it's possible, but I don't think likely. It's possible because, having lived through and participated in previous efforts at peace negotiations between the Israelis and the Palestinians, I worked for John Kerry. He sort of threw himself at this problem for years. Ultimately, I will not claim a lot of success, but certainly a lot of focus and effort and a high priority. What the Trump administration has now that no previous peace negotiators had for the Israeli-Palestinian conflict is something pretty significant that the Israelis actually want, that the United States holds the key to, and that is normalization with Saudi Arabia. And so if the Saudis and the Trump administration were to lock arms and say, this is available to you, but only if you do X, and then defining that X is the really hard thing, X on the Israeli-Palestinian file, if Israel takes whatever steps get laid out, then I think they have real leverage, positive leverage to induce. But that is, in some ways, just a thought experiment. Because if you look at the current government in Israel, the structure of it, how popular the current prime minister is, having basically made a central tenet of his platform that he is not going to go in the direction of two states, it is hard to imagine that coming to pass. The reason I say there's a chance is because this is actually something they want. But it's unlikely for all the other reasons.
Christiane.
Look, as somebody you've been involved intimately in policy and know a huge amount more than I do about this, and I've been intimately involved in covering the terrible conflict in that region for, ever since I became a foreign correspondent in 1990. Everybody who I've spoken to who's smart and intelligent and really believes and really understands what's going on, believes that unless the core problem of this is not addressed, everything else in the Middle East is mood music, nothing else really matters, and that worse, Israel could again face the despicable, savage attack that it did on October 7th. And I just want to, look, your own administration said publicly a few days or weeks before October 7th, that all's quiet in the Middle East. I genuinely believe, and many of the previous negotiators have said, that America needs to start actually really fulfilling its role as an honest broker and not always act as just one side's lawyer. And I want to finish what I'm saying now as a reporter, because I covered some of the Oslo process, and both the chief Israeli negotiator and the chief Palestinian negotiator became quite quite friendly. You know, the Oslo, so there was Uri Savir, who was the principal Israeli negotiator, and Ahmad Kurey, otherwise known as Abu Ala. And Uri Savir wrote a book called The Process. And in it, he quoted Ahmad Kurey, and he said something that literally sticks with me forever. I believe that we've arrived at the root of the problem, Savir recalls Abu Ala as saying. We have learned, Palestinians, we have learned that our rejection of you will not bring us freedom. You can see that your control of us will not bring you security. We must live side by side in peace, equality, and cooperation. And for me, that's really, that goes to the heart of the issue. And unless somehow that path can be reestablished, I know that's about 30 odd years ago now, but it's the only way forward. If this terrible, terrible wound is not healed, both sides will continue to suffer forever. And to me, that is the biggest tragedy when it doesn't have to be this way. And if you talk to ordinary people I know, as John has said, the far right, the Benjamin Netanyahu's are highly empowered right now. Israelis, according to Israeli journalists themselves, say that they're not getting a full picture of what's going on in Gaza, etc. They're also angry and traumatized, and it's a terrible, terrible time right now. But individuals, grassroots, Palestinians, Israelis who've worked for decades together, mothers, women, to try to bring peace, to try to break this down from a human level, I think still haven't given up. I platform them a lot on my show. And they haven't given up. And as long as people haven't given up, that, to me, is where the hope is.
And I should say that here at Columbia at SIPA, we've tried to put a lot in front of the students to understand even the history of the peace process. Because that was really important for us to make sure that they all know and understand. So we're almost at time. I want to ask you, each one of you, you are in front of students here who are studying in the School of International Public Affairs. They want to pursue careers in government, in NGOs, in journalism. What do you think the role of this generation is? What can we do? What should we teach? How should we teach it? And what advice do you have for the students here in this room?
So we can all, I guess, only speak from our own experience. Yep. One of the things I find is when I ask people for advice, often what they tell me is, do a version of what I did. So I'm trying to resist that impulse. But, on some level, we only know what we know. I'd say two things that I think could be really meaningful. One is get as much experience, I kind of hate this phrase, in the field as you can. Too few policy people have actually seen what policy looks like to the people who are on the other end of policy thousands of miles away. I don't have even a fraction of Christiane's experience in this regard, but I started my career as a journalist almost entirely in conflict zones, including in Gaza, including in Israel, Lebanon, Russia, Georgia, and Iraq, principally, where I lived for a couple years. And I bring those experiences into literally every issue that we take up in a room that has no windows, when I don't have the luxury of being able to actually talk to people out in the world who are experiencing U.S. policy firsthand. So get as much of that as you can before you go into policy. That's the first thing. The second, and this was the biggest challenge I had shifting from journalism into government, is it is one thing to be able to digest, understand, describe a situation of massive complexity. And that is a core skill set for a journalist, core skill set for a policymaker. But to be a policymaker who actually adds value, you have to take it one step further and diagnose, not just diagnose, prescribe what the government should do about that problem. And that I found extremely challenging at first. It can only, I think, really be born of experience through which you gain judgment. But you will not be great at these roles until and unless you actually know what the country, what the institution you work for should do about the problems, not just admire them.
I didn't know that about your journalistic experience, and I think it's so important, it's so great to hear that. I really do believe that everything I know has been informed by being in the field, and then obviously talking and interviewing and reading and all the rest of it. But you really get mostly to the truth when you're in the field collecting the forensic evidence of what's happening here, there, or everywhere. And I spent the first part of my career, most of it not talking to world leaders, but really talking to the individuals and the militia leaders or the NGOs and the hospital directors and, all those people who were directly affected by what was going on. And so I would always say, I always would advise a journalistic career, but in the field. Most people just want to be, they think that it's about being an anchor or being on social media or being whatever. Social media, in my opinion, is mostly now a truth destroyer, and I feel so sorry about that. It started by being such an enhancer, such a strong tool, and even today it can still be a strong tool. But unfortunately, most of its impact is to confuse us, to put lies and truths as if they were both equal, and that's a really difficult thing. So you actually, if you want to be a journalist, you have to get out there and check it out and figure out what's going on. And I always tell young journalists, just, your parents are going to hate me, but go out into the field. And a lot have, and a lot have come back, really happy that they did that and have had careers. Thank God they've survived. But, that's my advice.
So we covered quite a few issues, and I think that it's fair to say that we could have gone for another 2 hours just talking about the world and the state of the world. Please join me to thank Christiane Amanpour and John Feiner for a really wonderful conversation. And thank you so much for being with us, for taking time, and thank you for accepting this fellowship and spending some time with us.
You.
Really appreciate it.
Thanks, everybody.